what an introduction, the one and only. I can't say I've ever been introduced that way, but no pressure. I'll try and live up to it. And I wanted to say, I wish you chaired everything, Ambassador, starting with the men should take time to listen to the women. That would be great. So firstly, good afternoon from the UK, Excellency, ambassadors and esteemed guests. Thank you very, very much for inviting me to speak at the summit. And so let me introduce my background. As the ambassador said, I'm Cecilia Jastrzembska. I'm the vice chair for a national executive committee for the UK's oldest political think tank named the Fabians. And I'm a feminist foreign policy officer, which I think is an excellent title for the international network, as well as a senior policy advisor in the UK. I've campaigned for humanitarian causes for as long as I can remember. So we've talked about the COVID-19 pandemic a lot today, and justifiably so. But I'm going to talk to you about a very different kind of pandemic and the human rights violations that are happening as a result. The World Health Organization defines a pandemic as an epidemic occurring worldwide, crossing international boundaries, and usually affecting a large number of people. We know all too well the disease that has brought the world to a shocked and sad standstill. But what we don't see is the one that already exists, one that this pandemic is in fact already exacerbating. Not a zoonotic disease, accidentally sprung from natural evolution, but a disease that is written into the genetic signature of our society itself. A disease etched into the heart of our genomic architecture as a collective whole. A disease so insidious and so powerful that in 6,000 years of civilization as we know it, we still have not managed to expunge it. What am I talking about? I'm referring predominantly to feminicide, the gender-related murder of a woman by a partner, ex-partner or family member, and feminicidal violence generally. Rather than bats and pangolins, the pathogenic microbial agents of this disease walk among us and are often people we know. As found by the UNODC's global study on homicide, a total of 87,000 women were intentionally killed, and that's just in 2017. More than half, 58%, which translates to 50,000 women, were killed by intimate partners or family members. And more than a third, 30,000 women, killed in 2017, were murdered by their current or former partner. Remember that next time you see the question, why didn't she leave him? Many of these women had already left. Every day, this killer takes an average of 137 lives around the world. Congresswoman Martha Tagle from the Citizens Movement Party in Mexico said, "The deadliest pandemic for women in our country, more than the coronavirus, is feminicidal violence." You might have heard of Karen Ngala Smith in the UK. She founded the pioneering project Counting Dead Women, and she found that femicide has actually tripled since the first lockdown began in the UK in March last year. And in Mexico, almost 1,000 women have been killed since the start of last year, up 8% on the previous year. National helpline calls have increased by a third in France, and Spain has also seen a catastrophic rise in domestic violence, implementing the Mazzarella 19 campaign, encouraging victims to ask for Mask 19 in their pharmacies to call for help. We have a UK equivalent in Boots, where consultation rooms were made as accessible safe spaces for survivors of domestic abuse or violence. But this shadow pandemic has a further reach than just domestic violence, and media reporting is also part of that problem. The media has regularly reductively attributed the killing to the circumstances rather than the perpetrators. For example, the newspapers such as The Sun in the UK framing it as coronavirus murders, and The Telegraph as self-isolation murders. This constructs an insidious narrative that the virus is not only an accelerant to feminicidal violence, but that it is in fact to blame. And further implies that these murders and episodes of coercive control will dissipate once the lockdown ceases, or 3 lockdowns cease, when in reality, they existed long before those lockdowns and will exist long after. The restrictions of lockdown can expedite the transition through the stages of violence by providing a trigger, a catalyst, if you like. But it must not be characterized as the reason in itself, which can play into a whole climate of impunity, with killers effectively being exonerated from their crimes in the court of public opinion. So what else has happened apart from domestic violence increases on the women's side? Reports of street harassment, both in numbers and threat level, have also increased. You probably wouldn't expect it because you think everyone's indoors, but it's happening more. A study involving 1,000 women by Plan International UK showed that women perceived street harassment as worse and as occurring more frequently, with 1 in 5 reporting having experiencing it since the lockdown. I have personally lost count of the times that men have harassed me and my friends. It is a crime and hopefully will be made one. It's not a compliment. And I'm glad that you mentioned the economic fallout, Junior, and I'd like to build on that. Women are also the comparative precariat in the pandemic, being 3 times more likely to be impacted worse financially, as they are radically overrepresented in low-paid, insecure sectors, such as care, retail, and hospitality. When I represented the UK as the British South Asian Youth Summit delegate, Baroness Verma, who chairs a UN Women Committee, said she will always now seek to address climate change first, because the worst effects of climate change will be on the world's poorest, and the world's poorest, in terms of majority representation, will be women. Think of it like intersectional feminism. Black women are going to get it worse. LGBTQIA+ Black women will get it worse. And disabled LGBTQIA+ Black women would get it even worse. A cascade effect happens. And those discriminations, that bias, all of that intersects. There's another dark side to this shadow pandemic in the form of an international assault on women's bodily autonomy, our dignity, and a threat to our lives. I'd like to take this opportunity today, actually, to challenge a narrative that I'm sure you are all familiar with. For decades, we have been conditioned into believing that the contentious debate around abortion comes down to a binary decision, pro-life or pro-choice. It's a seemingly obvious demarcation to separate views on apparently opposing ends of the political spectrum. Take a second, indulge me, to think which camp are you in, pro-life or pro-choice? Now scrap that completely. What if we realized this is a false dichotomy? Bear with me. The pro-choice narrative germinated from the very self-evident idea that it is literally a right to choose what we do or don't do with our bodies. If a draconian government bans abortion, the woman loses that freedom to choose and is consequently exposed to substantial risk, of course. For example, she might have to go and undergo a really dangerous termination. She might have the threat of jail. In some countries, still face the death penalty, even when suffering a miscarriage, rather than attempting to abort. And of course, there's the risk of maternal death. It is not a fallacy to call it a right to choose at all. That's correct. However, the problem lies in the fact that it is deceptively framed as mutually exclusive with abortion, otherwise known as pro-life. So the pro-life argument purports that women should not have abortions for a variety of reasons. Essentially, the embryo or fetuses should have a right to life. But what that actually translates to in real terms is these embryos or fetuses' rights supersede the mothers, who are for legal purposes suddenly considered secondary citizens in the eyes of society. Pro-lifers often define the right to life at different points, which some right at the moment of conception, others at varying stages of gestation, making the argument more convoluted. But the baseline is proponents are primarily occupied with protecting life for religious reasons or otherwise. This is otherwise known as the exhausted hypotheses fallacy, the law of excluded middle. What does that describe? A statement that falsely claims something is an either-or situation, when there's actually at least one other valid option. The idea of irreconcilability between the two stances is the product of a long-standing patriarchal system of setting women up as collateral. It deliberately pits conservatives and liberals against each other in a constant game of identity politics. By relentlessly emphasizing this choice, swathes of the population are duped into missing a far more peaceful conclusion, which is one can be pro-life and pro-choice at the same time. One can disagree with a woman having an abortion, pro-life, but still respect her right to choose, pro-choice. And ultimately, anyone who disagrees with another's decision should not be able to prohibit them from taking that course of action. Just as a Christian would be legitimately condemned for ripping a headscarf from a Muslim, male-dominated governments cannot be legislating against women's rights just because they object to our decisions. Imagine for a second, just imagine the furor if governments forced men to have vasectomies. Really think about it. Imagine if governments around the world rolled that out right now. Never. It would never, ever happen. Because society values male freedom much more than women's. Many governments have exploited this pandemic to further restrict abortion rights, such as Poland. I'm sure you know about the protests. The DUP in Northern Ireland, despite having voted to legalize terminations, who have refused to roll out abortion services. Women from Northern Ireland had to do 16-hour round trips on the ferry back through the UK during a pandemic to get an abortion. Can just imagine how stressful an abortion is with that piled on top. These governments are taking the Churchillian route, who famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." But all people deserve physical liberty, not just men. Bodily autonomy should be an inalienable right for all. And we need to recognize not only the false dichotomy we're being duped into, but the fact that reproductive rights must be upheld without question. The data is clear. More abortions and unsafe ones actually happen in countries where the government is more restrictive. Yes, you heard that right. When you have a liberal government policy on abortions, less death happens. And that obviously includes women as well. Now, I've talked about the economic impact, domestic violence, feminicidal violence, abortions, and there's so much more to it as well. We know that women are picking up the slack when it comes to domestic chores. We know that women and gender pay gaps are getting wider. We know that women's academic submissions are falling, that They are much more likely to lose their jobs. Just look at the data in the United States. Almost 75% of the workforce that lost their jobs were women. So that's building on an already existing gender disparity and gender pay gap. We're going back 50 years, and if we're not careful, we'll go back further and further and keep backsliding. Ultimately, there is no cure-all vaccine to this shadow pandemic. The infection isn't localized. We can't simply surgically remove the tumor on the operating table of the world. But publicly dismissing misogyny in its forms, all of its forms, and discarding the tools with which to fight it is the equivalent of our body as a collective whole having an autoimmune reaction, fighting itself and shooting its frontline workers. We must actively recognize this systemic issue, implement early unconscious bias training, increase female representation in parliaments across the world using affirmative action. No, we are not an meritocratic society as much as I would love to be, and take a holistic approach to improving routes of accountability for crimes against women, small and large. It's all on a spectrum. That's by no means an exhaustive list, believe me, but putting the issue front and center of the agenda spotlight now is a good place to start. The Istanbul Convention as an embodiment of active recognition must be upheld, and we need to do more, not less, to close ranks against the common enemy that is violence against women. COVID-19 both exposed and exacerbated the stark inequalities that rip apart the fabric of our society. It has become unmistakably clear that the impact of the pandemic on women is vastly incommensurate with that on men. Ambassador Malik said earlier to us that human rights are only words unless we respect the humans, and mentioned the disparity in the societal privileges that men enjoy and women do not. So I say to you, women's rights are human rights. An attack on a woman is an attack on all of us, on the very heart of a democratic, fair and just society. Silence is compliance. I cannot stress that enough. So I invite you all to stand with me against gender discrimination in your home countries, in your conversations and in your everyday lives, because that's where the real problem and damage happens. I will leave you with a sensational quote by Australian feminist and founder of the charity The Cova Project, Gina Dunn. Feminism isn't about making women stronger. We are already strong. It's about changing the way the world perceives that strength. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.